July 1940. A Spitfire pilot lines up a German bomber in his sights, pulls the trigger on his new 20mm cannon, and hears silence. The gun the French said couldn't fit in a wing, the gun Britain's own commanders wanted scrapped, had failed again. So how did this rejected weapon end up gunning down over 1,000 Luftwaffe aircraft? To answer that question, we need to go back to where it all started. And where it started was with everyone, and I mean everyone, saying this gun was a terrible idea. The French company that built the cannon, Hispano-Suiza, had designed it to fire through the hollow center of a propeller shaft. That was the whole point. You bolted the gun to the engine, it fired straight through the nose of the plane, and that was that. When the British said they wanted to take this long, heavy cannon and shove it sideways into the thin wing of a Spitfire, the French engineers didn't just have doubts. They flat out said it was impracticable. Not difficult, not risky, impracticable. As in, don't even try it. And honestly, looking at the Spitfire's wing, you could see why. The wing was so thin that the cannon didn't even fit upright. British engineers had to lay it on its side just to squeeze it in. And even then, they had to add blisters, little bumps above and below the wing, to make room for the 60-round ammunition drum. Those blisters cost the plane 8 miles per hour of top speed. The French were furious. The British were doing things to their cannon that they never intended and never approved. As far as Hispano-Suiza was concerned, these were illegal modifications to a weapon the British had only licensed, not bought the rights to redesign. But the British didn't have a choice, because across the English Channel, the Luftwaffe was tearing them apart. It was the summer of 1940, and the Battle of Britain was raging. Every day, hundreds of German bombers and fighters crossed the Channel to pound British airfields, radar stations, and cities. And the Spitfires and Hurricanes scrambling to stop them had a serious problem. Their guns were too weak. Every British fighter in the sky carried 8 Browning machine guns that fired tiny .303 caliber bullets. These were rifle-sized rounds, and against the new generation of German aircraft, they were almost useless. Luftwaffe bombers were adding thick armor plates to their engines and cockpits. They were fitting self-sealing fuel tanks that plugged their own bullet holes. German planes were flying home with dozens of .303 holes punched through their fuselage and not a single critical system damaged. The numbers told the ugly truth. Combat reports showed that it took an average of 4,500 rounds of .303 ammunition to shoot down just one enemy plane. 4,500 bullets for a single kill. And the reason was simple. The 8 machine guns were spread across the wing, and at just 100 meters, the bullets scattered across a spread of over 1 meter. Even a perfectly aimed burst could miss. Meanwhile, the Germans already had the answer. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, the Luftwaffe's best fighter, carried 2 20mm cannons that fired explosive shells. One good hit from a 20mm round didn't just poke a hole. It blew a chunk out of the aircraft. The British were outgunned in their own skies, and the men at the top of the Royal Air Force knew it, but many of them still didn't want the cannon. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, the man running fighter command during the most desperate air battle in history, was firmly against it. He and dozens of experienced pilots looked at the early tests and saw nothing but problems. They called themselves the No Cannon Lobby, and their argument was painfully simple. What was the point of scrambling a squadron of cannon-armed Spitfires if the guns jammed the moment they met the enemy? And that was exactly what happened. Number 19 Squadron at RAF. Duxford became the first unit to receive cannon-armed Spitfires in July 1940. The pilots were told they were testing a new weapon that would change the war. What they got instead was a nightmare. The guns jammed constantly. Sometimes they fired one round and stopped. Sometimes they fired nothing at all. The G-forces of sharp turns and dives caused the ammunition drums to flex and shift inside the twisting wing. Spent shell casings got stuck in the ejection chutes. Pilots would chase a German bomber for miles, finally get close enough to fire, pull the trigger, and hear that awful silence. It happened over and over and over again. The squadron was so fed up that their commander did something almost unheard of in the middle of the biggest air battle Britain had ever fought. He formally requested the return of their old machine gun Spitfires. He wanted the 8-gun models back. The request was granted in September 1940. Even the legendary Douglas Bader, one of the most famous fighter pilots in the entire RAF, flat out refused to fly with cannon. He stuck with his 8 Brownings and told anyone who asked that the cannon was unreliable junk. So by the fall of 1940, the Cannon Spitfire was finished, rejected by the pilots, dismissed by the commanders, declared impracticable by the very people who designed it. The French thought the British were fools. The Luftwaffe didn't even know the weapon existed, and every single person who laughed at this gun, who wrote it off as a failure, who said it would never work, every single one of them was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. To understand how this broken weapon became one of the deadliest guns of the entire war, you have to understand the man who created it and what the British did to his design. The cannon's story begins in 1933 with a Swiss engineer named Marc Burkigt. He was the chief engineer at Hispano-Suiza, a company that was part Spanish, part Swiss, and part French. Burkigt had been asked to build a 20mm cannon that could fire through the hollow propeller shaft of an inline aircraft engine. The French military wanted it for their fighters, and Burkigt delivered something brilliant. He called it the Type 404, or HS-404 for short. What made it special was the way it worked. Most cannons of that era used a simple blowback system with a heavy bolt that absorbed the recoil. That heavy bolt made the gun slow and clumsy. Burkigt came up with something smarter. His design used gas pressure from the fired round to lock the bolt in place until the bullet left the barrel, then unlocked it to cycle the next round. Because the bolt was locked during firing, it could be made much lighter than a normal cannon bolt. A lighter bolt meant a faster rate of fire and a lighter overall weapon. For an aircraft gun, where every pound mattered, this was a breakthrough. The HS-404 fired a 20mm shell that weighed about 4.5 ounces and left the barrel at nearly 2,900 feet per second. That shell carried explosive filler inside it. When it hit an aircraft, it didn't just punch a neat little hole like a .303 bullet. It punched through the skin and then exploded inside, ripping apart fuel lines, control cables, and structural frames. One well-placed 20mm round could do more damage than 100.303 hits. The French put the cannon into their best fighters, the Morane-Saulnier 406, the Bloch 152, and the De Woitien 520, all mounted through the engine, exactly as Burkigt intended, and for engine mounting, the gun worked beautifully. But the British had a problem. They had bought the license to build the HS-404 in the late 1930s because they could see where aerial warfare was heading. Bigger planes, more armor, and machine guns that couldn't keep up. They needed a cannon. But the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that powered both the Spitfire and the Hurricane didn't have a hollow propeller shaft. There was no way to mount the cannon through the engine the way the French did. The only option was to put it in the wing. And this is where the British did something that would make Hispano-Suiza furious. They took Burkitt's elegant engine cannon and forced it into a place it was never designed to go. The Spitfire's wing was so thin that the cannon had to be laid on its side. A 60-round drum magazine sat on top, bulging out of the wing in blisters that every pilot could see. The gun was 7 feet 9 inches long and weighed between 93 and 110 pounds. Cramming it sideways into that narrow wing was like forcing a baseball bat into a mailbox. Everything about the installation was a compromise. And then the British went even further. When France fell to Germany in 1940, the French engineers who had been working on an improved belt feed system for the cannon were cut off. Their work stopped overnight. So British engineers picked up where the French left off. They got hold of a French belt feed design called the Châtellerault and handed it to British companies to develop and manufacture. The result was a completely new feed system that replaced the troublesome 60-round drum with a belt that could carry 120 rounds per gun. That was double the ammunition. The belt was fed by a spring-loaded mechanism that retensioned itself every time the gun fired. No more drums flexing in the wing. No more jams caused by G-forces shifting the magazine. The new belt-fed cannon was designated the Hispano Mark II, and it was essentially a new weapon built on the bones of the old one. The British also modified the cannon's chamber, shortening it and adding fluted grooves that let a tiny amount of gas seep around the cartridge case during firing. This unstuck the case from the chamber walls and eliminated the need for waxed ammunition. It was a small change that solved a huge problem. Hispano-Suiza was not happy about any of this. The British had taken their cannon, turned it on its side, redesigned the feed system, modified the chamber, redrawn every metric dimension into imperial measurements, and handed production to Birmingham Small Arms. The French company felt their weapon had been taken apart and rebuilt by people who didn't fully respect the original design. But here's the thing. Every single modification the British made was the reason the cannon eventually worked. The Hispano Mark II could fire between 600 and 850 rounds per minute. It hurled the same devastating explosive shells at the same punishing velocity. Its belt feed was reliable under the brutal G-forces of dogfighting, and it could be housed inside the wing of the fastest single-engine fighters in the world. The French designed a masterpiece. The British broke every rule the French set and turned it into a weapon of war that would arm an entire generation of fighters. The only question left was whether it could prove itself in combat. And that proof was coming faster than anyone expected. The story of the Hispano cannon's early days in combat is really a story about failure. Not the kind of failure that happens once and gets fixed. The kind that happens over and over again, in the worst possible moments, with lives on the line. And it started with the very first shot ever fired from a cannon-armed Spitfire in actual combat. In January 1940, months before the Battle of Britain even began, a young pilot named George Proudman took off in the prototype cannon Spitfire to intercept a German aircraft off the coast of Scotland. He closed in, lined up his target, and squeezed the trigger. The starboard cannon fired exactly one round and stopped dead. The port cannon managed 30 rounds before it seized completely. Proudman was left floating in the sky with two useless guns and a German plane flying away untouched. It was the worst possible introduction for a weapon that was supposed to change everything. But the people in charge didn't listen to the warning. Lord Beaverbrook, the Minister of Aircraft Production, was a man who did things fast and loud. When he heard about the potential of a cannon-armed Spitfire, he didn't want to wait for more testing. He ordered 30 Spitfire wing sets converted to accept the Hispano cannon with the highest possible priority. No more slow trials, no more careful development. Get the guns into the hands of frontline pilots and let them figure it out. And so on the 1st of July 1940, 3 cannon-armed Spitfires arrived at the airfield of No. 19 Squadron at RAF Duxford in Cambridgeshire. The planes were designated R6261, R6770 and R6776. The pilots gathered for a briefing and were told they were now the first operational squadron in the Royal Air Force to fly with 20mm cannon. More cannon aircraft would be arriving soon. They were expected to test the weapons in real combat conditions and develop tactics for using them. One aircraft had been tried before with some success up in Scotland, but there were known technical problems that still needed to be worked out. That was putting it mildly. What followed over the next 2 months was one of the most frustrating experiences any fighter squadron endured during the entire Battle of Britain. Day after day, the pilots of 19 Squadron scrambled into the sky to meet waves of incoming German bombers and fighters. The stakes could not have been higher. Britain was fighting for its survival. Every sortie mattered. Every kill mattered. And the cannon-armed Spitfires couldn't kill anything. The problems were everywhere. When a pilot pulled into a hard turn to get behind a Messerschmitt, the G-forces twisted the Spitfire's thin wing just enough to shift the 60-round ammunition drum out of alignment. Rounds jammed in the feed. When the pilot fired and the cannon recoiled, spent brass casings got stuck in the narrow ejection chutes. The sideways mounting that Hispano-Suiza had warned against was the root of nearly every failure. Gravity pulled the rounds in one direction while the drum tried to feed them in another. The gun was fighting its own installation. The pilots described it as the most maddening thing they had ever experienced. Imagine chasing a Heinkel 111 bomber for miles across the English sky. You can see the black crosses on its wings. You can see the rear gunner swiveling his weapon toward you. You close to 200 yards, then 100. You press the firing button and hear a single dull thud, followed by nothing. Your cannon has jammed. You are now sitting behind an enemy bomber with no weapons and a rear gunner shooting back at you. This happened again and again and again. The repeated experience of scrambling the entire squadron in the heat of battle, only to find the guns useless at the critical moment, was beyond frustrating. It was dangerous and demoralizing. By September 1940, the squadron had had enough. Their commander formally asked to swap their Cannon Spitfires for the older models, armed with 8.303 Browning machine guns. The request was approved, and 19th Squadron went back to machine guns in the middle of the Battle of Britain. But the story didn't end there, because a stopgap idea was already being tested. In November 1940, Number 92 Squadron received a new version of the Cannon Spitfire that carried a mixed armament. Instead of 2 cannon and nothing else, these planes had 2 20mm Hispano cannon and 4.303 machine guns together. The thinking was simple. If the cannon jammed, the pilot still had 4 machine guns to fight with. And if the cannon worked, even for a few seconds, those explosive 20mm shells would do damage that no machine gun could match. This mixed setup proved far more practical. Pilots could rely on their machine guns as a backup, while learning when and how the cannon was most likely to work. But by the time these improved planes reached the front, the Battle of Britain was essentially over. The cannon had missed its first great test, and everyone involved knew that minor fixes were not going to be enough. The gun didn't need a tweak. It needed a completely new way of feeding ammunition into the weapon. The 60-round drum had to go. What replaced it would change the entire war in the air, and that transformation was already underway. By 1941, the belt feed system that British engineers had built, the one based on the French Châtellerault design smuggled across the Channel before France fell, was finally ready for the front line. The troublesome 60-round drum was gone. In its place sat a belt of linked ammunition carrying 120 rounds per gun, fed by a mechanism driven by the cannon's own recoil. And when this new weapon, the Hispano Mark II, was fitted into the redesigned B-wing of the Spitfire, Mark 5B, everything changed. The standard arrangement gave each Spitfire 2 cannon-mounted inboard and 4.303 Browning machine guns mounted outboard. With double the ammunition of the old drums, a pilot now had enough rounds for several long bursts, instead of the pathetic few seconds the drums had allowed. The belt didn't flex, it didn't shift. It didn't care if the pilot was pulling 4 Gs in a screaming turn. It just kept feeding. By mid-1941, the cannon-armed Spitfire Mark 5B was rolling off production lines and into the hands of frontline squadrons. And for the first time since the war began, the RAF went on the offensive over the English Channel. No more waiting for the Germans to come to them. Now British fighters were crossing into occupied France on aggressive sweep missions codenamed Rhubarbs, Circuses and Rangers. Rhubarbs were low-level strafing attacks on targets of opportunity. Circuses were bomber escort missions designed to lure the Luftwaffe into the air. Rangers were deep fighter sweeps hunting for enemy planes wherever they could be found. And in every one of these operations, the cannon proved what it could do when it actually worked. The difference was violent and immediate. Pilots who had spent the Battle of Britain hosing Messerschmitts and Heinkels with streams of .303 bullets and watching them fly away now saw something completely different through their gun sights. A short burst of 20mm cannon fire hitting a Bf 109 didn't pepper it with small holes. It tore pieces off. Pilots described seeing flashes of bright orange light ripple across the enemy aircraft as each explosive shell detonated on impact. Panels of aluminum skin ripped away in the slipstream. Control surfaces shattered. And when a burst walked across a wing route, that critical junction where the wing met the fuselage, the result was catastrophic. The wing folded upward like a piece of paper and separated from the airplane entirely. Pilots who had flown the old 8-gun Spitfires said it was like going from throwing pebbles to swinging a sledgehammer. The sound was different too. The .303 Brownings had made a fast, light rattling buzz when they fired, almost like tearing cloth. The 20mm Hispano cannon produced a deeper, heavier sound, a hard, rhythmic thudding that you could feel through the airframe as much as hear. Pilots said you knew the cannon were working because the whole plane shook slightly with each round fired. And when those rounds found their mark, there was no ambiguity. You didn't have to wonder whether you had done damage. You could see it. Pieces of the enemy aircraft flying backward past your canopy, smoke pouring from holes that hadn't existed a second ago, a flash of fire as a fuel tank ruptured and ignited. Where the .303 had required patience and sustained fire to bring down a target, the 20mm cannon could end a fight in a single pass, lasting less than 2 seconds. Word spread fast on both sides of the channel. RAF pilots who had been skeptical of the cannon, and there were many after the 1940 fiasco, quickly became believers. Squadrons that still flew machine gun-only Spitfires demanded upgrades. On the German side, the change was noticed in a different way. Captured Luftwaffe pilots began telling their interrogators that British fighters were hitting harder than before. Planes that used to come home with manageable damage were now not coming home at all. German mechanics inspecting the wreckage found the telltale signs of 20mm explosive shells, large, ragged entry holes with blast damage radiating outward from each impact point. This was not machine gun fire. This was cannon fire, and it was killing planes that the old armament could never have touched. The cannon-armed Spitfire had proven itself. But proving the weapon worked was only the beginning, because across the channel, the Luftwaffe was about to introduce a new fighter that would push the Spitfire and its cannon to the absolute limit. And the race between British firepower and Luftwaffe desperation was about to enter its most dangerous phase. Just a quick moment. Thank you for spending your time with me. If you've enjoyed this story and you'd like more like it, please subscribe to Battle of Britain's Stories. It genuinely helps the channel, and it keeps these accounts alive. Right, let's carry on. The Luftwaffe's answer arrived in the autumn of 1941, and it was terrifying. The Focke-Wulf FW-190A appeared over the coast of France like nothing the RAF had seen before. It was fast, brutal, and carried a staggering amount of firepower. 2 20mm cannon in its wing roots and 2 machine guns in its cowling already gave it as much firepower as a cannon-armed Spitfire. And later versions would pack even more guns into those broad, sturdy wings. It could outrun the Spitfire Mark V in level flight. It could outroll it. It could outdive it. And the pilots flying it knew exactly what they had. German squadrons equipped with the FW-190 adopted a simple and deadly tactic. They climbed high above the British fighters, rolled over into a screaming dive, fired a short, devastating burst with all 4 guns, and then used their superior speed to pull away before the Spitfires could turn and respond. Hit and run, over and over again. For the first time since the cannon-armed Spitfire had begun proving itself, the balance of power shifted back toward Germany. The RAF took heavy losses through late 1941 and into 1942. Spitfire Mark V squadrons flying offensive sweeps over France found themselves outmatched by the FW-190 at almost every altitude. The cannon armament was still effective when pilots could get their guns on target, but getting into a firing position against a faster enemy was the problem. The FW-190 pilots didn't stay and fight. They slashed through the British formations, picked off a straggler or two, and vanished before anyone could chase them. Morale in fighter command took a hit. For the first time in over a year, the RAF was on the back foot in the air war over Western Europe. But the Germans made a critical mistake. They assumed the Spitfire Mark V was the best the British could do. They looked at their speed advantage and their firepower and believed they had solved the problem of British air power. What they didn't know was that deep inside the Rolls-Royce factory, engineers had already built the engine that would erase every advantage the FW190 enjoyed. The Merlin 61 was a new version of the famous Rolls-Royce Merlin fitted with a two-stage, two-speed supercharger. It produced dramatically more power at high altitude than any previous Mark of Merlin, and the aircraft built around it, the Spitfire Mark 9, would become one of the most important fighters of the entire war. The Mark 9 began reaching frontline squadrons in mid-1942, and the effect was immediate. It was faster than the FW190 at most altitudes. It climbed better. It turned tighter, just as every Spitfire had before it. And crucially, it carried the same proven cannon armament that had been ripping Luftwaffe aircraft apart since 1941. 2 Hispano Mark II cannon and 4.303 Browning machine guns in the standard B-wing configuration, or in later production runs, 2 Hispano cannon and 2 heavy .50 caliber American Browning machine guns in the new E-wing. The FW190 pilots, who had spent months diving through British formations with impunity, suddenly found Spitfires that could chase them down, match their speed, and kill them with explosive 20mm shells. The advantage evaporated almost overnight. And the British weren't just building better planes, they were building better wings for the cannon. The C-wing, introduced in late 1941, was called the Universal Wing because it could be configured in multiple ways. A squadron could fit 4 20mm Hispano cannon with no machine guns at all, a pure cannon fighter with devastating firepower. Or they could mix 2 cannon with 4 machine guns. Or they could go back to the old 8 machine gun setup if the mission demanded it. The flexibility was remarkable. Squadrons could tailor their armament to the specific job. Bomber escort? 2 cannon and 4 machine guns for a balance of firepower and ammunition capacity. Ground attack? 4 cannon for maximum destructive punch against vehicles and fortifications. The Luftwaffe had nothing like this adaptability. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the Americans were learning a painful lesson about the Hispano cannon. They had licensed the weapon and begun producing it in huge numbers. But their version was a disaster. Under United States Army regulations, any weapon with a bore larger than 0.6 inches was classified as artillery. That meant the American Hispano had to be manufactured to artillery tolerances, which were far looser than the tight precision the weapon needed to function reliably. The parts didn't fit together properly, and the problem was hidden by coating every cartridge in a thick layer of wax to help it slide through the sloppy chamber. The British had already solved this exact problem with their shortened, fluted chamber, the same modification that Hispano-Suiza had objected to back when the British first redesigned their cannon. It worked perfectly. The Americans refused to adopt it. The result was the ANM-1 cannon, and it was so unreliable that over 56,000 of them were manufactured before anyone admitted the misfire rate made them essentially useless. The British eventually gave up waiting for the Americans to fix their version and simply increased their own production. This contrast tells you everything about why the British modification mattered. The original French design needed changes to work in a wing. The British made those changes, often against the wishes of the original designers. The Americans tried to produce the cannon without making the same changes, and they failed spectacularly. The so-called illegal modifications, the shortened chamber, the fluted walls, the belt feed system, the sideways wing mounting, were not reckless tinkering. They were the precise engineering solutions that turned a good idea into a working weapon. And by 1943, that weapon had become the foundation of a production effort so massive it would drown the Luftwaffe in a tidal wave of explosive cannon fire from which there was no escape. The numbers tell a story that no amount of bravery or genius could overcome. By 1943, the British war machine was producing Hispano cannon at a pace that would have seemed impossible just 3 years earlier, when the gun couldn't even fire a full magazine without jamming. Birmingham Small Arms, the company known simply as BSA, became the beating heart of cannon production. Their factories turned out Hispano cannon by the thousands, and by the time the war ended, BSA alone had manufactured approximately 42,500 Hispano cannon of various marks. That is not a typo. 42,500 cannon from a single company. And BSA wasn't working from one big factory that could be wiped out by a single bombing raid. The British had learned that lesson the hard way in 1940 when the Luftwaffe targeted the Supermarine works near Southampton. Production of the Hispano was spread across a network of shadow factories, smaller plants scattered across the English countryside, hidden in towns the Germans would never think to bomb. One of these shadow factories operated in Newcastle-under-Lyme in Staffordshire, tucked away in an industrial area where the locals knew what was being built but never spoke about it. The cannon rolling off these production lines armed virtually every major British fighter type from 1941 onward. The Supermarine Spitfire was the most famous, and over 20,351 Spitfires were built during the war. Every single one from the Mark 5B onward carried at least 2 Hispano cannon, but the Spitfire was only part of the story. The Hawker Hurricane. Mark 2C carried 4 Hispano cannon in its thicker, sturdier wings. The Hawker Typhoon, the fearsome ground attack fighter that would terrorize German columns in Normandy, also carried 4 cannon. Its successor, the Hawker Tempest, mounted 4 of the improved Hispano Mark 5, a shorter-barreled version that was lighter, fired faster, and fit entirely inside the wing with no protruding barrel to cause drag or freezing problems. The de Havilland Mosquito, that extraordinary twin-engine fighter bomber made partly of wood, carried 4 Hispano cannon in its nose in fighter variants. The Bristol Beaufighter, the heavy night fighter that hunted German bombers in the dark skies over Britain, packed 4 cannon as well. And when Britain's first operational jet fighter entered service, the Gloucester Meteor, it carried 4 Hispano cannon. The same gun that had jammed after 1 round in 1940 was now the standard weapon on the most advanced aircraft the Royal Air Force possessed. The ammunition that fed these cannon was produced in equally staggering quantities. Each belt-fed Hispano Mark II in a Spitfire carried 120 rounds. A 4-cannon Typhoon carried 480 rounds of 20mm ammunition on every sortie. Multiply that by thousands of aircraft flying multiple missions per day, and the consumption of 20mm shells across the RAF was enormous. The factories producing the ammunition ran around the clock, turning out shells filled with explosive compounds and incendiary mixtures. The 2 main types were semi-armor piercing incendiary and high explosive incendiary. The semi-armor piercing rounds could punch through light armor before detonating inside the target. The high explosive rounds detonated on contact, blasting shrapnel and fire in every direction. Both were devastating against aircraft, and both were being produced in numbers that the German war economy could only dream of matching. And this was the real killer. Germany produced excellent weapons. Their MG 151/20 cannon was a fine 20mm gun, and their MK 108 30mm cannon could destroy a heavy bomber with just a handful of hits. But Germany's problem was never the quality of their weapons. It was the quantity of everything else. By 1943, Allied factories, British, American, and Soviet combined, were producing more aircraft than Germany and Japan put together. The RAF's pilot training pipeline was graduating thousands of new aircrew every year, each one trained in cannon gunnery, formation flying, and combat tactics. These pilots arrived at their squadrons with hundreds of hours of flight time and dozens of hours of weapons training. They were competent, confident, and well-equipped. On the German side, the picture was the opposite. Fuel shortages caused by Allied bombing of synthetic oil plants meant that Luftwaffe training programs were cut to the bone. New German pilots in 1944 sometimes arrived at their combat units with fewer than 100 hours of total flight time. Some had never fired their guns at a moving target. They were being thrown into the sky against seasoned RAF and American veterans flying cannon-armed fighters, and the results were predictable. Germany was losing 40 aircraft per day by 1944. Monthly aircrew losses reached 25%. For every experienced German pilot killed, his replacement was less trained, less prepared, and less likely to survive his first week of combat. It was a death spiral that no amount of courage could stop. The contrast is almost painful to think about. On one side, a nation with dispersed factories producing tens of thousands of cannon, endless belts of ammunition, and thousands of well-trained pilots to use them. On the other side, a nation with brilliant engineers and brave pilots, but not enough fuel to train them, not enough factories to replace their losses, and not enough time to develop answers to the weapons chewing their air force to pieces. The Hispano cannon was not just a good gun. Backed by the full weight of British and Allied industrial power, it became an overwhelming force. A single cannon could kill an airplane. 42,500 of them, mounted on tens of thousands of fighters flown by well-trained pilots, could kill an entire air force. And in the summer of 1944, that is exactly what they did. By the summer of 1944, the Hispano cannon had reached the peak of its killing power, and the skies over France became a slaughterhouse for the Luftwaffe. On the 6th of June, Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy in the largest amphibious invasion in history. Above them, thousands of Allied fighters provided an umbrella of air cover that the Germans could barely penetrate. And the men doing much of the killing were flying cannon-armed Spitfires. One of them was a quiet, determined Englishman named James Edgar Johnson, known to everyone as Johnny. The Canadian squadrons he commanded had insisted the RAF give them Johnson as their leader, and he repaid their loyalty over Normandy. And on the 29th of June 1944, his wing had one of the most devastating days any fighter unit recorded during the entire war. That single day, Johnson's pilots destroyed 26 of the 34 Luftwaffe aircraft shot down over the Normandy battle area. 26 kills in one day from one wing of cannon-armed Spitfire Mk9s. Johnson himself would finish the war as the top-scoring Western Allied ace against the Luftwaffe, with 34 confirmed aerial victories. Nearly every one of those kills came from the twin Hispano cannon mounted in his Spitfire's wings. But Johnson was not the only pilot writing his name into history with cannon fire that year. On the 29th of December 1944, a young French-Canadian named Richard Audet took off in his cannon-armed Spitfire Mark 9 with No. 411 Squadron of the Royal Canadian Air Force. What happened next became one of the most extraordinary single-sortie performances of the entire air war. Audet spotted a formation of German fighters and dove into them. In a furious, swirling engagement that lasted only minutes, he shot down 3 Focke-Wulf 190s and 2 Messerschmitt 109s. 5 kills in a single mission. 5 German fighters torn apart by 20mm explosive shells from a weapon that most of the RAF had once written off as useless. Audet would claim a further 5.5 victories in the weeks that followed, making him one of the war's most lethal aces in the shortest span of time. But war does not spare its heroes. On the 3rd of March 1945, Richard Audet was shot down and killed while strafing a German train in his Spitfire. He was 22 years old. The cannon gave him the power to destroy 10 enemy aircraft in a matter of weeks. It could not protect him from a burst of ground fire on a low-level pass. While the Spitfire ruled the skies above the battlefield, the Hawker Typhoon and Tempest were turning the cannon into a ground-level terror weapon. The Typhoon carried 4 Hispano cannon and became the premier close air support fighter in Normandy. Its pilots flew at treetop height over the hedgerows of France, hunting German tanks, trucks, staff cars, and anything else that moved. The 4 cannon tore through thin-skinned vehicles like they were made of paper. Locomotive engines burst open under cannon fire. Convoys caught in the open were shredded in minutes. And the Tempest Mark V, armed with 4 of the improved short-barreled Hispano Mark V cannon, found an unexpected role that perfectly suited its speed and firepower. When Germany began launching Phi-1 flying bombs at London, small pilotless aircraft packed with explosives and flying at nearly 400 miles per hour, the Tempest was one of the few fighters fast enough to catch them. Tempest pilots used their cannon to shoot down 638 V-1 flying bombs before they could reach their targets. The cannon's high rate of fire and explosive shells made it the perfect weapon against these small, fast targets that needed to be destroyed in a single pass. On the German side, the picture was one of despair. Captured Luftwaffe pilots in late war interrogations described what it felt like to face the cannon-armed fighters. The 20mm shells didn't just damage your aircraft, they shattered it around you. Pilots spoke of seeing bright flashes erupt across their wings and fuselage, of feeling the airframe shudder and break apart, of canopies cracking and instruments exploding in their faces. The psychological impact was enormous. Where a spray of machine gun bullets might rattle a cockpit and punch a few holes, a burst of cannon fire felt like the hand of God smashing your airplane. German pilot morale, already crumbling under the weight of fuel shortages and impossible odds, collapsed entirely. The undertrained replacements the Luftwaffe was now throwing into the sky, boys with barely 100 hours in the cockpit, were no match for the cannon-armed veterans hunting them. On the 1st of January 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, a massive surprise attack on Allied airfields across Belgium and the Netherlands. It was the last great gamble of the German Air Force, a desperate attempt to destroy Allied air power on the ground. Spitfire units scrambled to meet the attackers and joined the brutal fight that cost the Luftwaffe over 300 aircraft and many of its remaining experienced pilots. The cannon did its work with brutal efficiency. Bodenplatte cost the Luftwaffe over 300 aircraft and many of its remaining experienced pilots. It was a wound the German Air Force would never recover from, and the Hispano cannon had helped deliver it. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the Hispano cannon had completed one of the most remarkable journeys of any weapon in military history. A gun that couldn't fire more than one round in its first combat test had become the standard armament on virtually every British fighter aircraft for the last 4 years of the war. But the story didn't end with the German surrender. The principles that Mark Burkitt built into his original design and the modifications that British engineers forced upon it would echo through decades of military aviation and shape the way fighter planes are armed to this very day. The Hispano Mk5, the final wartime version with its shorter barrel, lighter weight, and higher rate of fire, became the bridge between propeller-driven fighters and the jet age. The Gloucester Meteor, the jet that had already entered service carrying 4 Hispano cannon, was joined after the war by the de Havilland Vampire, armed with the same weapon. The weapon that had been designed in 1933 to fire through the propeller shaft of a French engine was now powering through the sky at speeds its creator could never have imagined, mounted in aircraft that didn't even have propellers. The Hispano served in early jet fighters well into the 1950s, nearly 2 decades after Burkitt first drew the plans. And when the Hispano finally was retired, its children replaced it. British engineers used everything they had learned from modifying and perfecting the Hispano to develop the Aden cannon, a 30mm revolver-type gun that armed a generation of Cold War fighters, including the Hawker Hunter, the English Electric Lightning, and the Harrier jump jet. The French, drawing on the same lineage, developed the nearly identical Difa cannon for their own fighters. Both weapons fired the same 30mm ammunition, and both traced their engineering philosophy directly back to the lessons learned from making the Hispano work in places it was never meant to go. Across the Atlantic, the Americans finally caught up. After spending the entire war struggling with their poorly manufactured copies of the Hispano, the United States Air Force kept using .50 caliber machine guns through the Korean War. It wasn't until the mid-1950s that they finally admitted what the British had proven in 1941, that 20mm cannon were the future of fighter armament. The M39 revolver cannon and then the legendary M61 Vulcan rotary cannon followed, and the Vulcan remains the standard gun on American fighters today, including the F-16 and F-18. The road from Burkitt's 1933 design to a 6-barreled rotary cannon spinning at 6,000 rounds per minute on a modern jet fighter is long, but the thread is unbroken. Today, surviving Hispano cannon can be found in museums across Britain and the world. The Imperial War Museum holds examples alongside the Spitfires and Hurricanes they armed. The RAF Museum at Cosford preserves the oldest surviving Spitfire, serial number K9942, a Mark I that flew before the Cannon era, a reminder of the days when 8 tiny machine guns were all a pilot had. The Potteries Museum in Stoke-on-Trent, just miles from the BSA Shadow Factory in Newcastle-under-Lyme that produced thousands of the Cannon, displays a Hispano alongside the story of the local workers who built them. And at airshows across Britain every summer, the sound of Rolls-Royce Merlin engines fills the sky as restored cannon-armed Spitfires fly once more. The crowds look up and see the characteristic bulges in the wings where the cannons sit, and most of them have no idea that those small bumps represent one of the most important engineering battles of the entire war. The numbers speak for themselves. 42,500 Hispano cannon produced by BSA. Over 20,000 Spitfires built, the vast majority carrying cannon. Thousands more Hurricanes, Typhoons, Tempests, Mosquitoes, Beaufighters, and Meteors, all armed with the same weapon. Collectively, these cannon-armed aircraft destroyed thousands upon thousands of Luftwaffe planes across every theatre of the war, from the Channel Coast to North Africa to the skies over Berlin itself. The exact number will never be known because no one kept a separate count of cannon kills versus machine gun kills. But when you add up the victories of cannon-armed fighters from 1941 through 1945, the Spitfire aces, the Typhoon ground attack missions, the Tempest pilots chasing V-1 bombs, the Mosquito night fighters hunting in the dark, the total reaches well into the thousands. The claim of over 1,000 Luftwaffe aircraft destroyed is not just defensible, it is almost certainly a dramatic undercount. And perhaps the greatest irony of all is this. Hispano-Suiza said their cannon could not be mounted in a wing. The British did it anyway. The RAF's own commanders said the cannon was unreliable and wanted it scrapped. The British fixed it anyway. The Americans tried to copy the British modifications, refused to adopt the critical changes, and produced over 56,000 useless cannon before admitting failure. The British just built more of their own. Every person who dismissed this weapon, every engineer who said it was impracticable, every pilot who demanded his old guns back, every bureaucrat who wanted to stick with machine guns, every single one of them was proven wrong by the stubborn, relentless work of engineers who refused to accept that the problem couldn't be solved. There is a moment that captures it perfectly. Sometime during the Battle of Britain, Hermann Göring demanded to know from his commanders what they needed to defeat the RAF. The young German ace Adolf Galland looked the head of the Luftwaffe in the eye and said he wanted a squadron of Spitfires. He wasn't joking. He knew. The enemy always knows. And by the time the cannon-armed Spitfire reached its full potential, Galland's words had become a prophecy. The gun they mocked, the modification they called impossible, the weapon they rejected, it didn't just work. It won the sky.